So as I mentioned, Alice Greenwald, who's been with the museum for quite some time now, 16 years, but who's counting? After an exhaustive search, they just announced that Elizabeth Hillman will be she'll be the incoming president and CEO in October. And so I just wanted to take a minute and introduce Elizabeth Hillman. Elizabeth Hillman is nationally recognized leader in higher education, history, justice, and equality, and an expert in the U.S. military justice system. She began her career as a space operation officer in the U.S. Air Force, which she served for 7 years, including 2 years as an instructor of history at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Most recently, Elizabeth served, and I guess you go by Beth, correct? Served as the 14th president of Mills College, the first women's college west of the Rockies. So it's really an honor and privilege. I understand beyond the gala where you spoke earlier this week, this is her first public appearance. So I want to welcome Beth Hillman.
Thank you, Mary. I want to start by saying I'm grateful that I have the benefit of the guidance from all of you, from people like Mary Fetchit and Voices, and all of the families, all the survivors, all the extraordinary staff at the Memorial Museum who are helping me understand the magnitude of this new task that I've just begun on. I've spent the last few weeks learning more about the outreach and the education efforts of the Memorial and Museum, and I look forward to hearing more in the weeks ahead. I also want to thank Alice Greenwald, whose extraordinary leadership will be very difficult to follow. And I feel because of her incredible success over the 16 years, she's been leading efforts to bring 9/11 to new generations. I feel it's even more important that the next phase of the Memorial Museum be as powerful and have as much impact as the first. I'm also a parent of children, now young adults, born like more than 80 million people here in the United States after 9/11 who have no lived memory of this experience. And it's especially important we find ways to bring your stories and the stories of all those who experienced 9/11 to those young people in the future. And I look forward to the chance to do that. Thank you for giving me a chance to join you here today.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome. And of course, we've had a long-standing relationship with the museum, and we're really looking forward to working with you, as you join the leadership are the leadership of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Another transition that's happened recently, we've worked with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner really since right after 9/11 when we started meeting with Dr. Hirsch as he was both collecting and identifying the victims. And so that relationship has gone on now for 21 years, and we've seen some transition in the OCME's office as well. So I wanted to give Dr. Graham an opportunity to talk with you, introduce himself. Dr. Graham recently was appointed the Chief Medical Examiner of New York City by Mayor Eric Adams in April of 2022. In this role, he oversees investigations into deaths in New York City and the operation of the largest public DNA laboratory in the nation. He previously served as the acting chief medical examiner since 2021 and as first deputy chief medical examiner, the second highest leadership position within OCME since 2013. And I was just meeting with the staff at the OCME, and I think the continuity that we've seen in both of these organizations in the staff at both the museum and the medical examiner is really so critical with the families. Dr. Graham joined the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in 2006 And so I want to welcome him after 16 years at the OCME to the podium to take a few minutes to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mary. And I'm so thrilled to be able to be here and honored to be here. We have such a special relationship with Mary and the Voices group for 21 years now. And I'm honored to represent the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, I think the finest group of forensic professionals in the world. I am not a native New Yorker, as you might sense by some of my accent that trails in from time to time, but I grew up down south and finished my medical training there. And then when looking to find the perfect job in forensic medicine for me, I could look nowhere else other than New York City. And the reputation of this office, and in particular, Dr. Charles Hirsch, who was the longtime chief medical examiner of the city starting in 1989, who led our agency through 9/11 and beyond. His influence is what drew me to New York City. And when I made it here, he sat down with the newbies in the crowd and he shared his personal 9/11 experience. We each have our own memories and we each have our own 9/11 experience. Mine was not in New York City. When I joined the OCME, Dr. Hirsch sat down and he shared his personal experience from the day and from the challenges that the office faced after that. And he closed by sharing the commitment that he made to all of the families. And that commitment has stood the test of time. Dr. Hirsch also told us that being at the OCME, the New York City 9/11 experience was part of our culture now. And it indeed was and has been for the entirety of my time at this agency. I was lucky enough to serve Dr. Hirsch in the office until his retirement in 2013. I've served in various positions at the office until very recently. And after Dr. Hirsch's retirement, I had the honor of, for nearly the past decade, of serving as the second in command to Dr. Barbara Sampson, who succeeded Dr. Hirsch as chief. Until her departure recently, when I was appointed by the mayor as a chief medical examiner. And I can reassure everyone that the commitment that Dr. Hirsch made 21 years ago, that he maintained throughout his time as chief medical examiner, the commitment that Dr. Sampson held strongly to, and the relationships that we have with the families is going nowhere. I want to reaffirm that today and commit to all of you that the work to do everything we can for as long as it takes to identify those who were lost on 9/11, we will persist in that. And so I'm delighted to be here and honored, and I thank you very much.
In any particular order.
Pick it. Okay, so this session was really focused on looking beyond 9/11, but I think it's really looking beyond the 20th anniversary. And so I think that it's, before you look beyond, you have to look in the past. And, you know, as I mentioned, two of the organization's Voices has been so involved in really from the very beginning. You know, I think about the museum. I think before the museum was a thought, Voices was involved as a, you know, family advocate with the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation as they were planning what they were going to do at the site. And similarly, I remember meeting Dr. Hirsch at one of the first meetings that was held at the mayor's mansion, and talked to him about the collection and identification of remains. And they were certainly in the middle of that process monumental, both of these were monumental processes that they worked through. And so I thought it was really important, as there's a transition going on with both of these organizations, to invite my two dear friends, Alice Greenwald, the CEO and president at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and Barbara Sampson, the former chief medical examiner in New York City. So I wanted to talk about, I think back, Barbara, I don't think I met you that early on, but Alice, when you joined the museum in 2006, I remember meeting you at some of those early meetings, and you had let me read some of the things. She was in charge of developing programming, preparing exhibits, choosing artifacts, designing educational components, organizing and coordinating all the operational details of the museum. So maybe you could talk a little bit about those early days.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Mary, and it's delightful to be here. I have been speaking at these forums for 16 years. And I can remember, actually, the first one that I attended, which would have been in September of 2006. And I was here with Max Bond, of blessed memory, who was the lead architect for Davis Brody Bond at the time, charged with both overseeing the architecture of the memorial, but also all of the architectural design work below ground in the museum spaces. So he and his partners at Davis Brody Bond were our creative partners in developing the museum. And I can vividly remember, standing in front of a crowd of people and just being terrified because I didn't know what I was going to say. It was so early in the process. But those early years, there was so much turmoil around the project. What was it going to be, and would we be able to address all of the very sincerely felt aspirations of any number of constituents from any number of parts of this story. And so there was a lot of listening that had to go on in the beginning, because we needed to navigate really all of the different perspectives and try to hear them, try to figure out a way to integrate those perspectives. We also inherited from the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, it was a 2-page single-spaced list of everything that needed to be included in the museum. And this had been developed over a period of time with the Family Advisory Council, with a group of museum and cultural experts who they had brought in as consultants. And it was a very thorough process, and it resulted in this, what we used to call the roadmap, which was, we would have to figure out a way in the space of this museum to incorporate all of this, this content that we were expected to cover. So it was a daunting prospect. But I think the listening was the most important part of those years of planning. We had something called the Museum Planning Conversation Series, which you and Frank attended. This was a series of discussions initially, the first summer of 2006, where we invited about 90 people. It was, a small group. But each person there represented another stakeholder community. So it was family members of victims, it was first responders and first response agencies, it was rescue and recovery work, it was everybody, Lower Manhattan residents. I mean, we really tried to bring everybody literally into the room. And that first summer, we just asked big questions like, what kind of museum are we building? How do you deal with traumatic memory in physical space? Where does 9/11 fit in the American historical narrative? They were really big, big questions. But what we succeeded in doing by having those questions brought forward and bringing in people who were experts in their fields on these topics is that we all began to speak the same language. So that when we would refer to something, we knew immediately what the other person was referring to. And by having a common language, we could then build together what would become the Memorial Museum. And that planning series literally went on for another 7 years. I mean, it was something we would come back with design ideas. We would bring them forward to this group. Membership in the group changed over the years, but this was our sounding board. And it needed to be authentic to that group for us to feel we were making the right decision. So it was very much a collaborative effort of planning. And then the only other thing I would say that was very much on our minds in those years, and it's different now, and it was that in 2006, 5 years after the attacks, it was almost impossible to imagine anyone coming into this museum who didn't come in with their own, what we call in the museum business, their own entry narrative, their own association with 9/11, their own memory of that day, where they were, how they felt, who they spoke to, who they lost. Whatever they experienced, they'd come in with. And we needed, again, to build a museum that would feel authentic to whatever entry narrative somebody would come in with. So that was a huge task. We also, in the back of our minds, realized it wasn't always going to be that way. And it seems to have happened, that transition seems to have happened much quicker than any of us really could have imagined back then, which is, today, a large proportion of our museum visiting population are among the, 80 million to 100 million Americans, and certainly larger if you go global, but Americans have been born since 2001. And they come in without any entry narrative other than, oh, that's past history. And it can't be past history, because 9/11 is really where this century began. And if you're going to understand the century you are growing up to inhabit, then you need to understand where it started. So we have a big educational task in front of us. The museum, I believe, because it is rooted in stories, authentic stories, from the people who were there, from the moments that this story literally unfolded before our eyes, I believe it will remain resonant for a new generation, because we all respond to stories, and stories are the way we transmit value and we transmit empathy. So that's really, I think, in some sort of where we started and where we have to go.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned those early days, because we announced earlier that we started the monumental task of archiving all of our work over the last 20 years. And we have many of those presentations are recorded. And I remember there were stick figures in the designs that, right, you're anticipating may come to fruition. So it's going to be, a walk down memory lane looking back at those. Barbara, you joined, maybe you could talk a little bit, I don't know if you'll share that funny story about when you started with the medical examiner.
With the pipe?
Pardon?
With the pipe, is that?
Yes.
Yes. So I started with the medical examiner's office as a fellow July 1st, 1998. And every afternoon, Dr. Hirsch, for the first few months of fellowship, would meet personally only with the 4 fellows and teach us the basics of forensics, go over cases and all of that. And I have seasonal allergies, and Dr. Hirsch smokes a pipe. So one day we came into conference, and I brought my tissues, and I'm tearing up and sneezing, and Dr. Hirsch is, of course, puffing on his pipe. And he looks at me and he says, "Barbara, is my pipe bothering you?" And of course I go, no, Dr. Hirsch, I'm fine, I'm fine. And then he said, "Oh, well, that's good, because there's still time for you to find another fellowship."
And we've been in Dr. Hirsch's office, and, the pipe scent, and he didn't have any, any rules or regulations about the indoor smoking, despite probably other people in the office.
I still keep a pipe on my desk when I need to channel Dr. Hirsch. Yep.
But tell us about the internship. So you were there on September 11th. Could you talk a little bit about your experience?
Sure. At that point, I was a junior attending, and we were actually in a safety training conference when the person who was leading the conference stopped the conference and had somehow he found out, I don't know how he found out, but he said a plane has crashed. And we were all a little bit in disbelief. I went out to go see what was going on. And I had no idea what was going on. And I said to myself, well, Dr. Hirsch will know what's going on. And he, every morning at about, I forget what time it was, 9 o'clock, yeah, he would have conference every morning where we would meet and discuss cases. So I was sure he was going to be there and be able to answer all my questions about what had happened. And he wasn't there. And that's when I knew something big had happened, because he had gone down with Mark Desire, and who is here today, and several other people to see with his own eyes what had happened.
What were the challenges when, after 9/11, how did the medical examiner's office respond?
Yeah. Well, as every New Yorker wanted to do something to help. Everyone everywhere wanted to do something to help, but it was so palpable in New York here. And I think one of the things that made the people who work in the medical examiner's office, brought them comfort, is because we knew right away what needed to be done. And we knew that we were just going to make as many identifications as we possibly could from day one. There was never a question. That's one thing, when you met Dr. Hirsch, whatever he said went. That's what he was like. And when he said, we're going to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, that just resonated with absolutely everyone, and we knew that we would figure that out. And it's funny you mentioned that we really didn't meet until quite a few years later, but I feel like we had met, because Dr. Hirsch would always in the afternoon conferences talk about his meetings with the families, with you, the challenges, the legal challenges, the DNA challenges, whatever was going on, in order to educate the next group of medical examiners who someday, hopefully not, but someday were likely to meet a similar disaster that they had to deal with. So he always felt that you shouldn't have to repeat his mistakes, that he was very happy to tell you about all his mistakes so that you could learn from them. So that was it. And what Dr. Graham said, this is our culture at OCME, that we can't even think otherwise. Of course we're going to do everything we can as DNA technology evolves, and continue working with you and fulfilling your needs in whatever way is best, whether that's through science or through good communication and just being there for each other.
Well, the thing is, though, when I think about, the medical examiner's office is responsible to make IDs, but 2,753, what was that task like? How did you
overwhelming?
Go about it?
Yeah. Well, again, we all had full confidence in Dr. Hirsch, because he would know what to do. And he has a saying that he always reminded us of when anytime anything got busy: how do you eat a elephant, Barbara? One bite at a time. And that's exactly what we did, dealing with, the most immediate problems first. And then as time went on, just dealing with the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. He handled all the politics and all that kind of stuff, and we handled the science, the doctors and the scientists. So it was huge, but we never, it never really felt overwhelming, because we were just going to keep marching forward, however long it took.
And who did you have to collaborate with? Did you call in the hospitals or the universities?
Right. As from day one, everyone wanted to help in any way that they could. So I remember, hospitals calling, what do you need? I did my PhD at Rockefeller University. They called, do you need sequencing apparatus? They were willing to give us everything from a technical point of view for DNA work. Tiffany's came by and they gave us ring sizers. We had little blue bags delivered to the office. And so that we could do that, we had shoe, those old-fashioned shoe, to tell your shoe size, people donated those. All kinds of things like that from every walk of life. Of course, NYPD was there by our sides. So many volunteers, medical students from all over, particularly NYU, because we're located immediately next to NYU, had so much support. We even had a massage therapist for a while, which it's an interesting story with Dr. Hirsch. So there was someone that instead of massage therapy, she offered touch therapy. So Dr. Hirsch went in, and he had hurt his ankle he was hurt, yeah, in more ways than one. But his ankle was really bothering him. So he thought he would go get like a little massage or something. And he got the woman with the touch therapy who just took her hands and held her hands around it, away from his ankle like that. That did not go over well. But the massages were nice. That's everybody just, outpouring of support in every single way you could imagine.
And what was your role during that time?
I was one of the, probably at that point, about 30 medical examiners responsible for examining each remain, documenting what we got, taking a DNA sample, and making sure it was properly recorded and then stored. But remember, those 30 medical examiners were still responsible also for the day-to-day work of the office, so all the quote-unquote routine cases that came in, and also remember that flight, the airline that crashed also during that 587. Right, so that was just 2 months after 9/11. So it was a very, very busy time.
Well, I think about that time frame when everyone came to help, but then you reach a point where you're sort of on your own. And you're dealing with tough content. I know, Alice, you came from the Holocaust Museum, so similarly, you were talking about or working with difficult content. How did you work through that, on a personal level?
Meaning, after working with difficult content all day, how do you manage psychologically?
Well, I think the combination between the stress of the situation at the time and the workload associated with that in both of your jobs, and then on top of that, dealing with this content.
It's hard for me to give you a good answer, because I think when you are committed to a project like this, it is so all-encompassing that you just keep doing it. You do it because you have to. It's like what Dr. Hirsch said. You're eating this elephant and you take this bite and then you have to go to. You're focused on getting the job done and doing it right and doing right by the people who care about it most, and that just takes over. And I guess you do need to be the kind of person who can compartmentalize. You have to. There are moments when the stories and the content get you, and you're not prepared that it will, and you just have to take that moment. It's inevitable. We dealt with some very difficult material, and you have to be looking at it from this almost dispassionate place. You're looking at film that's very graphic, and you're thinking, well, how much of this are we going to put in the museum? So it's a dispassionate kind of technical looking at something. Well, if we use those 16 seconds as opposed to these 18 seconds, what's the message? So you become very intellectualized about what is otherwise deeply, deeply emotional content. And you sort of have to stay in that place or you can't get the work done. But that doesn't mean it doesn't get to you. And the other answer to your question is that while you're always dealing with this very difficult emotional content, you're also regularly being reminded of all of the good stuff that happened in response to the evil. There were stories upon stories upon stories of people just stepping outside themselves and doing whatever they could. There are people who would hug strangers on the street. They would talk about their 9/11 stories as being about generosity and companionship and compassion and service to community. And I think those stories are the antidote to the other work, because there wasn't a day that went by, and that's true to this day. There isn't a day that goes by where I am not, reminded about the best of who we are. And it's this strange way into the best of who we are, because, it's in the context of the worst. But that to me is the heart of the museum, is that it is a reminder that, terrible things are going to happen, and we can't always prevent them from happening. In fact, who knew a pandemic was coming? There are things you don't know are coming, and you are forced to deal with them, and you don't have control over them. But you do have control over how you respond. And 9/11 is the best case study I know of for the best of human response in reaction to the worst. So that gives you the motivation to go on.
And Barbara, how about you?
I think my answer is so similar to yours, especially as a medical examiner. Everything we do is very emotionally challenging every single day, every case, every person. And during a period like 9/11 and Flight 587, it was even compounded further. But we just had to keep going, and there was so much work to do, and you really didn't look up. Now, I was pregnant during the 9/11, and I had my daughter in March, so then I took my maternity leave in March, and so I was gone for 4 months from just visiting for social events. And then when I came back then in July, I could see how worn down everybody else was, because I had taken that break and stepped back and enjoyed my daughter and my family, and they were still at it. The office worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 9 months, because anytime any remains came in, there was always a medical examiner there to examine them immediately. Getting that distance and seeing that really made me much more aware of how important self-care is and taking care. Back then, especially amongst doctors in particular, you just didn't do that. Somebody like Dr. Hirsch, that didn't even cross his mind. Right? We had a job to do, and that was the culture then. And it's so different from what the office now embraces in wellness and having all kinds of support, therapy dogs, routinely visiting because of the challenging nature of our work every single day. So I think we're much better, in a much better position now to deal with these other manifestations of the challenge that we deal with.
The other thing I think both of you navigated very well is working with the victims' families. And, victims' families are not the friendliest people to work with. I mean, they want answers, they want things done. And I think both of you, in an odd sort of way, shared that same challenge. How did you deal with that, Alice? And it wasn't just the victims' families, that you had the responders, the survivors, the residents, the corporations, the financial pressures. I mean, there were a lot of different stakeholders that you had to navigate.
There were certainly moments. I can remember some of the early encounters at the planning conversation series where, it felt like people were, taking me by the lapels and talking to me like this, even though they weren't, There was an intensity of encounter. Mm-hmm. But I think it's that you have to step back and realize that the emotion that is coming through the conversation you're having with people who are in such pain is just, it's not about you. You just have to step back and say, this isn't about me. This is about pain that needs to be addressed, and we have to figure out a way to hear it, to take it in, and to deliver something that is going to address what that individual feels will be helpful and healing. You build trust over a period of time. It really is about a trust-building exercise, and most of that is about being available to talk and to listen and to recognize that you're not always going to agree. And when you have, families, nearly 3,000 families who've lost someone in a horrific murder, mass murder, you're talking about 10, 12,000 immediate family members. That's a lot of people. And there's going to be differences of opinion and perspective and not necessarily a lot of agreement. So you also had to bear in mind that what you were hearing from one person might not be shared by the other, 11,999 people.
Even within their own family.
Even within their own families, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was a matter, it's being respectful, it's listening, it's trying to navigate through another person's very intense need, and to be open to the conversation. I mean, we were open, frankly, to changing our plans. We had to be. We couldn't come into a room of family members and first responders and Lower Manhattan residents and say, this is what we're going to do, and whether you like it or not, that would have been ineffective. I can remember having one of these sessions, and our designer was presenting. I can't even remember what it was, but I think it may be where the Finch wall ultimately ended up. They were very proud of what they had designed and presented, and they go through this whole presentation, and at the end of the presentation, complete silence in the room. And then 3 or 4 of the family members who were in the front row came up and said, not going to work. And I remember what it was.
It wasn't me, was it?
And it does. It has to do with the OCME repository, because this is the wall which is the wall that is the interior of the museum, but on the other side of which is city-owned property, which is managed and operated by the medical examiner's office, where the repository of unidentified remains are located. And because of the architecture of the Memorial Museum, that is the first space you come to when you've gone down the ramp to get to what we call bedrock, the foundation level. So as we were thinking through the design of the visitor journey, we had to figure out, okay, the first thing you're going to see when you get to bedrock is the wall behind which is a repository of human remains. That seemed somewhat out of sequence. It seemed very difficult emotionally. And so our designers, our exhibition designers, were really trying very hard to figure out what to do. And one of the early decisions we made was the Virgil quote, which I think everybody knows, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," which we really felt resonated with our story. And our exhibition designer found an artisan blacksmith in New Mexico, Tom Joyce, who we sent remnant World Trade Center steel pieces to, and he fired the steel to shape the letters of the quote. And I remember it was Tom Hennis from Think Design is presenting this, magnificent quote made of refired World Trade Center steel that had gotten this beautiful iridescent blue tone to it. And he was so proud of the design, but it was sitting on what the rest of the museum is like, which is a raw concrete wall. Right? You're in the foundation of the World Trade Center. We weren't prettying up the space. It's an archaeological site. So you had this very powerful quote on a raw concrete wall. And he presents this with such pride. He thought, we nailed the challenge. And 3 or 4 family members came up and said, if my loved one is behind that wall, it can't be raw concrete. It was as simple as that. It was like, if that is the space, it needs to have more dignity. It needs to be something other than what is the rest of the environment you're in. And that set us ultimately down a path of exploring different facings for the wall. Granite didn't feel right.
Yeah, and we were talking about marble. And
marble, you remember. And ultimately, someone in the team, said to us, well, the only thing that's going to work here is a work of art. Because anything else you do is going to be the wrong intervention. And art is the only thing that can speak to the heart. And we ended up with the Spencer Finch blue wall, which is an amazing work of art that now surrounds the quote. But that was a reaction to hearing from family members who felt adamantly that we were not addressing their needs. So it was an iterative process.
And I remember myself feeling that I didn't want the repository in the north-south tower or the south tower. I felt it was really, in a sort of a way, a place that should unify the families, and it should be centrally located.
And the original memorial design had placed the repository on the north footprint.
Yeah. So Barbara, could you, I think the process that you had was so challenging too. It wasn't just collecting and, preparing the remains and collecting the DNA samples, which, I don't know how you did that with 90 people living in 93 countries, but you did. How many remains was it 20,000?
Yes.
That were collected?
Yeah.
And you still have that 7,000 in your possession?
I think that's about the, Dr. Graham, go ahead. Yeah.
There's more than that.
Yeah, it's.
Okay. And there's a little over 1,100 families that have never been notified. And I know how appreciative the families, and again, Dr. Hirsch presented here, every year, met privately with the families to update them. And I think about, how hopeful they were to have their loved ones identified. And so that his commitment was really important to the families. But what was that like, that process? Because again, you're dealing with families, for over 21 years now. What was that process like as you were going through, notifying the families, updating the families, and, I think there must have been questions that came up that you had to address.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, a lot of people don't realize that the medical examiner on a day-to-day basis interacts with families routinely. We don't, operate in a, morgue, down in the basement, not speaking to anyone. We actually speak to a lot of people, from DAs and police to families routinely. Obviously, this now took on a scale beyond, the routine. And I think, again, one bite at a time. Understanding what the questions are, what the problems were and continue to be. The good communication, I think, was absolutely critical, as you've mentioned so many times. The routine meetings with Dr. Hirsch, updating at the beginning very often, and then at least annually. But as the science improved, the DNA lab grew and grew and grew with a dedicated group to the unidentified that continues till today. So I also wanted to say that it is a very special relationship, because the medical examiner does have relationships with each family, but it usually only lasts a day or two, maybe a week, maybe a month or two. And the relationship that we have, that many of our staff have with families, has gone on now for 2 decades, and sometimes with different generations within a family. And that's something that is, I think, unique in the medical examiner world. To have that kind of experience. It's more of a family physician experience, right? For someone that we feel like we're caring for the entire family. Dr. Hirsch used to say that the medical examiner is the family practitioner for the grieving. And we really embraced that. And that was what our relationship with you and my personal relationship with the families that I have met really is the most treasured part of my career.
Well, the same goes on our end too. And I think when we were doing some work together recently for the 20th anniversary, we talked about that, how unique it is that you have, as a medical examiner, a relationship with families for over 21 years and counting. And then I think our partnership was based on, making sure that you were able to contact them. Because when you look back 20 years ago, people didn't have emails, they didn't have cell phones, and then of course, with 21 years passing, some family members are no longer with us, and it's their children or their extended family members that need to be aware of the process, especially for those 1,100 families. And I think too, so I think that was a special relationship. And Alice, I think, beyond being on the advisory committee, the Living Memorial was such a great project.
Absolutely.
And I wondered maybe if you want to speak about, how that contributed to the museum?
Well, I assume everyone in this room knows what the 9/11 Living Memorial is, but in case you don't, it really was one of the first digital databases of personal effects, memorial material, photographs, biographies of victims, and it was a constantly growing resource. And one of the things that we knew immediately when we began work on the Memorial Museum was that we wanted a memorial exhibition. We wanted a place dedicated to the 2,983 victims. And where the memorial upstairs was about absence, we wanted the sense of presence in the museum, and we wanted you to remember people or meet people for the lives they lived, not the ways they died. And so our memorial exhibition was very much oriented to giving access to the human experience of a family, of people who knew these individuals. And we tried to write biographies for the memorial exhibition that captured who they were from the point of view of the people who loved them. So we have these recorded remembrances, and they play in the memorial exhibition. They're not a curator telling you about someone they didn't know. It's a son, a daughter, a colleague, a neighbor, whatever. And the living memorial became really an essential resource for us in developing what became our interactive tables. So that when you go into the memorial exhibition, you are standing in a room where floor to ceiling, all four walls, you are surrounded by the faces and names of nearly 3,000 people. And it's a very visceral experience. You know immediately it's a microcosm of the world. And what you're experiencing when you walk in is the scale of loss. But when you go over to these interactive touchscreen tables, the wallpaper on the screen is the walls that surround you. So you can find, just by moving it, the name of somebody you want to know more about, or you can find somebody just by calling up a name. It almost, you just call it as a computer and you call it up, and then you open up a whole gallery, if you will, digital gallery of information to learn more about this person. And where there's a recorded remembrance, you can play it and listen to it on a wand. If there's an obituary that was included in Living Memorial and we have it in the table, you can read that. You can see sometimes people have, their report cards from 6th grade in there. I mean, it's interesting the things that people keep that connect them to their loved ones, and that material is there. So this became really an essential partnership for developing the content and restoring access to the fullness of someone's life.
Well, now remember, I think you were just starting at the memorial, and we had launched the Living Memorial Project, and our staff, for anyone in the room or online that may not know, our staff traveled around, met with families and community centers and libraries and so forth, and they collected over, I think it was over a decade, we worked on it, over 87,000 photographs that we collected. And so when Alice began, I started when I'd meet with her, I'd bring in like a selection of photographs and say, Alice, look what they're collecting, because they were bringing tangible items. I remember a woman from Boston brought in the 5 Stanley Cup rings that her husband had won playing for the Boston Bruins. So we decided we would photograph it. So I think even some of the photographs that we took and the memorials that we had documented, and then of course our quilt collection that we would have on exhibit here. I kidded when they started collecting things, the quilts would come in the front door here at the symposium. The symposium was over, they'd go right into their collection. So it was really, again, a unique type of partnership where we were able to identify things in advance, so when the memorial was built, absolutely, you had the collection.
And I think what's so interesting, Mary, is that what Voices was doing was providing a therapeutic activity for families to feel that they were creating this cache of material that would preserve the memory of their loved one. And what it meant for the museum was it gave us this cache of material so that a much broader public could understand the human impact of terrorism. So it was a complementary a partnership, because we weren't achieving what you were achieving, but what you were achieving allowed us to do what we needed to do, which I think is a wonderful definition of partnership. And I just want to share what we talked about at the benefit the other night, which is that this partnership and reciprocity went on for 16 years.
It did.
And you know, when we began work on the memorial exhibition, we set a goal for ourselves back in 2006 that we wanted to put a face to every name. That was the goal. And we got pretty close after a while. I mean, we opened, and I think we had all but about 20 or 21 portraits. There were 2 or 3 instances where families said we would prefer not to have a portrait, and we honored that. But there were about 20 or 21 we really wanted to track down. And over time, after we had opened the museum, we found all but 2 of them, which was incredible. And we were still stuck on these last 2. And we had this breakthrough in March, I think, where one of our staff had just tracked down where one of these individuals who had worked at Cantor Fitzgerald in the cafeteria, where he had gone to high school. You know, and he sort of made inquiries with the high school. Would anybody remember from 1979, you know, somebody, you know, who graduated there? And it turned out that there was a former teacher who was now doing something else entirely, but he found her, and she went to the library, and she found a photo of this man, amazingly enough. In the library was a yearbook from, I think, what would have been his freshman year, but it was the senior year yearbook, and yet there was a photo of him in it. So suddenly we had 1 photo to go. And there was a news article about the photo that we had just found, which was for a man by the name of Albert Ogletree. And we were still looking for a man by the name of Antonio Dorsey Pratt, who also worked in the cafeteria at Cantor Fitzgerald High in the North Tower. And the day after the news article came out, I get a call from Mary, and she goes, Alice, I think we have a photo of Antonio Dorsey Pratt. And I'm like, but Mary, you know, we went to you for, you know, for years to get photos, and wouldn't that have come in, you know, when we created the memorial exhibition?
No, we received a call from his friend during COVID, and we were probably one of the few offices that were in the office to answer the phone, and there was some complication in him sending the photo, and so after the anniversary, he contacted us again, and it was right around the time that you made the announcement that you were going to be retiring, and I thought, what a wonderful, you know, that we finished this project together, and it was just so fitting.
It was amazing, isn't it?
Yeah,
you know,
really
I get off the phone with Mary, and I go, huh? And I walk over to my curator's office, and I said, you're not going to believe this, but Voices has a photo, and indeed, it's a beautiful photo, and it is now in the memorial exhibition, and you know, as I said, that was mission accomplished. It was a great sense of achievement, but again, none of it could happen without the partnership.
It was a final, we closed that chapter then, right? And Barbara, I think too, similarly, our partnership with you has been just such a pleasure, and you know, I knew Dr. Hirsch so well. He used to come to our galas like Alice, and he would, I spoke at his retirement party, and then I spoke at his memorial party. I'm one that cries, so I did cry at Dr. Hirsch's memorial ceremony. But I wondered, you both transitioned from a role that you started when you joined the organizations that you're with, and then what was that transition like when you know, ended up being in the leadership position there? Because it was probably a shift for you.
It was a big shift. You know, I come out of mostly the content side of museum work, the curatorial side, creating exhibitions and so forth. And while I had done administrative work, it was always in that area, you know, specifically exhibitions, education, collections. And in 2017, I became the president and CEO of the Memorial and Museum, which meant that I sort of had to let go of the content side of things and let other people do that work, pay attention to it, but it wasn't mine to do anymore. And that was a big shift, because now you're the leadership position, you're dealing with budgets and HR and public relations and boards, and it was a very different set of priorities. But I was so honored to be in the role. I care so much about the institution. It was a great learning experience for me, and it allowed me to take an institution I had invested so much in creating, and then making sure that we could steer it to continued success, even with the challenges of a pandemic. So it was a great experience, truly.
And Barbara, how about you?
Yeah, well, very similarly for me, but first I worked side by side with Dr. Hirsch since 1998 and his first deputy for many years before he decided to retire. So I really did have a feeling, at least, for the ins and outs of the operating the medical examiner's office. But similarly, I went from being purely a physician and a scientist to being really an administrator, which is a totally different role and having obviously huge shoes to fill at the same time. So, it's a great challenge, but we have such a great team at OCME. So many people have been there that you've known since the very beginning, have been there 20, 30 years plus. So it was such a strong team. Dr. Hirsch used to say, this place works better when I don't go on vacation. So I just kind of went with that and continued to build on his, the very strong foundation that he had, until stepping down recently.
And I think my last question is, what's your fondest memory or your biggest accomplishment that you think during your role at the museum and at the OCME? You probably could write a book.
I could write a book. And, I've been privileged to meet some extraordinary people in this role. And, and I always say I'm a Jewish girl from Long Island, but when the Pope came, that was it for me. It really was indelible, that moment where he had his multi-religious meeting for peace in our foundation hall, and I just took my breath away, the whole thing. But more recently, I would have to say one of the most important experiences I've had that I will take with me is I took my 9-year-old grandson to the museum for the first time a few weeks ago. And we'd been waiting and waiting because didn't feel he was old enough. He'd been to the memorial, but he had never been inside the museum. And my daughter wanted him to at least experience it with me before I retired. So we brought him through, and I was terrified. It was the most daunting tour, I've done hundreds of thousands of tours, and this one terrified me. And I met with our educators a couple of times to get some guidelines of what I could say, what I couldn't say, what I could show, what I couldn't show. And that's, I think, the memory that's going to stay with me most, because he was hanging on every word, and he was asking good questions, and he was engaged, and it really felt like this is something he'll remember, and that's important to me. So.
Barbara?
Well, akin to your event with the Pope, we were honored to have Vice President Biden visit us when he was Vice President. He came to the DNA lab to announce the funding for the backlog, ending the backlog of sexual assault kits throughout the country using federal money and also money from forfeiture here in New York City. And he came to us because New York City was the first big city way over a decade ago to eliminate the backlog in sexual assault kits. And he did happen to say that we had the best lab in the entire world. So I was very, very proud about that. But one of my most special experiences with regard to the families of 9/11 is a family member who I meet here. There are two great experiences. One, a family member that I meet here every year who so much appreciates what we do, but we had a very frank talk a few years ago. And she said, I understand you want to do the best and keep testing and identify as many people as possible, but it's very difficult for me to live with that the lingering hope. And it would be much easier if you could give me a letter saying that, we've done everything that we can do, and for now, this is the end for this effort for you. And I wrote that letter for her, and last year she just, hugged me for minutes and minutes and minutes and gave me this beautiful bracelet as well. So that's, just a memory that I will cherish, as well as a few years earlier meeting with a family from abroad. They came, an elderly couple came, and they thought probably for the last time they would be able to come to New York. And we had just by happenstance identified their son just a few days earlier. That. And to meet with them and be able to tell them that and have them just burst into tears because they were convinced that they would die without knowing. And to be able to give them that closure is, one of the most special experiences I could ever imagine.
Well, I want to end by saying those in the room and those that are listening online and those that may not have had an opportunity to join us today are so grateful for all of your work. And I'm personally grateful for the opportunity to work with you. So this year, for the 21st anniversary, we have this, it's a piece of artwork that was created by an artist in Kennebunkport, Maine. And he's no longer with us, but Frank and I wandered into their gallery, and his wife mentioned that they were very good friends with the Bush family.
Oh, sure.
And I noticed this painting. She didn't know that I had anything to do with 9/11, but I mentioned this painting, how beautiful it was, and she said, well, my husband created that right after 9/11, and he presented the Bush family, has many of his paintings in their homes, plural, and he had presented this to President George Bush, and there's a letter on the back from Mrs. Bush noting that she was going to be presenting it to the Presidential Library. Oh, so I thought this would be a nice small token of our appreciation for all of your work. And I know you're not going far.
No.
So Barbara, I'm told, I had a call with her and she still had the OCME bit lanyard around her neck. But I know that you're not going far, and I'm really looking forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely.
And appreciate so much all you've done.
Thank you. It's just a beautiful opportunity.
Yes.
Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful.
I didn't cry. Frank guy says, now don't cry.
You're close. You're very close.
I'm very close, and I could see him in the seat going, oh. But anyway, thank you so much.
Those are your glasses.
Thank you.
Of course.